This is the Music Halls of Fame podcast. This week, we honor the year in music for 1989, along with a member of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame class of 1989. We also make the case for putting the Pixies into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and our Spotlight Hall of Fame isn't a hall. It's the Library of Congress National Recording Registry in Washington, D.C. Before we get going with the podcast, like everyone tells you, please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you'll know when these podcast episodes drop, which is usually every Thursday. Now, on to this week's episode. The year was 1989. In music, the factors that set the stage for the seismic changes in music and pop culture in the 1990s started to show themselves in 1989. Nirvana, for instance, released their first recording, Bleach, on Sub Pop Records, the record label that would help to break grunge into the mainstream in the early 1990s and to also help to completely transform music in the decade. Nine Inch Nails, in the meantime, released their album Pretty Hate Machine. Within a few years, they would help to jumpstart industrial music for that decade. The New Kids on the Block, meanwhile, started off a new wave of boy band mania as the group's album Hangin' Tough led to them being almost everywhere on television and radio for a few years, and also led to a number of copycat groups. Bands like the Stone Roses, New Order, 808 State, and the Happy Mondays worked their magic with both rave culture and Britpop. Also, bands like Tesla, Motley Crue, and Warrant rode that last wave of the hairband era as the double shot of grunge music and Guns N' Roses were about to crush the hairband era in the next couple of years. A late-night talk show, of all things, would also end up playing a part in the cultural transformation as well. The Arsenio Hall Show debuted late in 1989. Arsenio went after the younger college-age audience that loved both pop and hip-hop instead of the older late-night viewing crowd that watched other networks. This was smart in an era where you either had to stay up late to watch the shows or videotape them. With Arsenio's youth strategy, his show soon crossed over into the mainstream, especially with corporate America who wanted to sell their products, of course, to people under the age of 30. Arsenio, to be sure, was not the first late-night host to go after the Gen X crowd. David Letterman actually became a star doing that in the 1980s with Late Night with David Letterman on NBC. However, to be blunt about it, Letterman was not about catering to the R&B or hip-hop crowd. Arsenio was. Arsenio's show helped to break artists like MC Hammer, Paula Abdul, and Mariah Carey in the early 1990s. It also, in a weird pop culture moment in 1992, had then-presidential candidate Bill Clinton playing the saxophone with a pair of sunglasses, of course, as Clinton's way of appealing to the youth vote. It worked. Clinton won the 1992 election and became a two-term president. Another trend that started in 1989 and was active in the early 1990s was the revival of swing music, as swing dance classes and swing music clubs started to pop up everywhere. In country music, the big albums of the year were released by artists George Strait, Hank Williams Jr., Clint Black, Randy Travis, Alabama, Reba McEntire, Willie Nelson, the Kentucky Headhunters, Keith Whitley, whose album was released after he passed away from alcohol poisoning a few months earlier, and a guy whose debut album was released in 1989 but would go on to break all sorts of records in the 1990s, Garth Brooks. Singles-wise, the top country songs were Clint Black's Nobody's Home, Alabama's Southern Star, Shenandoah's 24 Roses, and The Church on Cumberland Road, K.T. Oslin's Hold Me, Dolly Parton's Yellow Roses, Dwight Yoakam's I Sang Dixie, Rodney Crowell's She's Crazy for Leaving, Randy Travis's It's Just a Matter of Time, and the late Keith Whitley's I'm No Stranger to the Rain. Even though pop and R&B still ruled dance music with artists like Madonna, Janet Jackson, and Karen White, trance, house, acid house, and rave culture worked its way from America into worldwide youth culture, especially in Great Britain and Amsterdam. Songs like Maurice's This Is Acid and D-Mob's We Call It Acid hit number 1 on the Billboard dance charts, along with Inner City's classic song Good Life, 10 Cities' That's the Way Love Is, Can-Can's heavily sampled I Beg Your Pardon, and Little Louie's French Kiss, whose 12-inch single version was famous for 3 minutes of a woman moaning while having sex. Eurodance also became popular, with acts like Technotronic putting out classic dance tracks like Pump Up the Jam, which helped to set up the Eurodance craze of the early 1990s. Britain's take on hip-hop broke through with artists Nena Cherry and Soul to Soul. De La Soul's album 3 Feet High and Rising continued America's alternative hip-hop trend. Elsewhere in hip-hop, there were artists showing up on the pop charts like LL Cool J, Heavy D and the Boys, The Beastie Boys, EPMD, Tone Loc, Young MC, MC Lyte, Big Daddy Kane, Queen Latifah with her debut album All Hail the Queen, Third Base, Biz Markie, Ice-T, DJ Jazzy Jeff and the Fresh Prince, and Chub Rock. 1989 was also the year that Ice Cube left NWA. Meanwhile, in hip-hop, 2 Live Crew's album, As Nasty as They Wanna Be, would become a favorite conservative target, with politicians still claiming to that day that hip-hop was dangerous to America and that this particular album was Exhibit A of the danger. In the next couple of years, the 2 Live Crew would be arrested in Florida on obscenity charges for performing songs from the album, and a United States court would make the album the first album in American history to legally be declared obscene, which led to the album being banned in most corporate record stores until a heavily censored version of the album could be put out. The group eventually would be acquitted of those obscenity charges, by the way. All of this fear-mongering about hip-hop would eventually be softened in the early 1990s by mainly 2 artists, for better or worse, Vanilla Ice and MC Hammer, who made hip-hop more palatable to suburban parents and sold millions of copies of their albums in the process. Bands that formed in 1989 included Marilyn Manson, Stone Temple Pilots, Typo Negative, 4 Non-Blondes, the Dixie Chicks, Beats International, Belle Biv DeVoe, the Black Crowes, the Cranberries, Damn Yankees, CNC Music Factories, EMF, En Vogue, Brand Nubian, The Breeders, Dred Zeppelin, Fear Factory, Firehouse, Fuel, The Lightning Seeds, Lynch Mob, Marky Mark and the Funky Bunch, Hole, Infectious Groove, Oaktown 357, Joe Public, Orbital, Real McCoy, The Rembrandts, Teenage Fan Club, School of Fish, Silk, and the Wallflowers. All of those groups would be heavily involved in the music of the 1990s. Bands that broke up in 1989 until their inevitable reunion or announced their hiatus, of course, included Accept, the Lords of the New Church, Night Ranger, the Bangles, Autograph, Quiet Riot, Dawkins, DeBarge, the Style Council, Till Tuesday, Survivor, Hip Sway, the Jackson 5 or the Jacksons, depending on how you look at it, Gladys Knight and the Pips, and Wah Wah Nee. Bands that reformed in 1989 included the Plasmatics. Bobby Brown's Don't Be Cruel was the biggest selling album of the year. Other big albums that year were by, among others, Milli Vanilli, Debbie Gibson, Fine Young Cannibals, Madonna, Bonnie Raitt, Alana Miles, Extreme, XTC, the Goo Goo Dolls, Soul to Soul, Richard Marx, Tom Petty, The Cult, Great White, The Cure, Nena Cherry, Clint Black, Reba McEntire, 10,000 Maniacs, Queen, and Prince's Batman soundtrack. Janet Jackson's album Rhythm Nation 1814 came out in September of 1989, but became a huge hit in 1990 as well as beyond. Madonna's music video for her song Like a Prayer created controversy, shocking, not shocking, and was banned by MTV, also shocking, not shocking, along with her losing her sponsorship with Pepsi at that point. Like a Prayer was also the biggest selling single of the year, not exactly non-coincidental. Other big singles were the Bangles' Eternal Flame, Phil Collins' Another Day in Paradise, Roxette's The Look, the B-52's Love Shack, Chicago's Look Away, Paula Abdul's Straight Up and also Cold Hearted Snake, Janet Jackson's Miss You Much, and Poison's Every Rose Has Its Thorn. Musical artists who were born in 1989 included Taylor Swift, who of course would name her Grammy-winning album after the year she was born, Ali Michalka of Ali and AJ, Chris Brown, Jason Derulo, DJs Zed and Avicii, Tyga, Mike Will Made It, Joe Jonas of the Jonas Brothers, BB Rexa, rapper G-Eazy, Prince Royce, Trace Cyrus, and Jordan Sparks from American Idol. Musical artists who passed away in 1989 included composers Irving Berlin, Mikhail Chalaki, Virgil Thompson, Sammy Fain, Jan Sicker, Lennox Berkeley, Vaclav Kaslik, George Lynn, Donald Voorhees, opera singer Einar Anderson, musicians Billy Tipton, Joe Raposo, Roy Eldridge, Vincent Crane, Damaso Perez Prado, Pete DeFreitas, Albany Jones, Hibari Masura, Carl Stewart Hamblin, Alan Seville, and Pedro Vargas. Country music singers, the aforementioned Keith Whitley, and also Blaze Foley, jazz trumpet player Woody Shaw, guitarist John Cipollina, conductors Giuseppe Patane and John Pritchard, singers Nara Liao, Rashid Badbadov, Raul Sexas, and Bradley Kincaid, folk singers Ewan McCall and Trevor Lucas, bandleader Henry Hall, radio disc jockey Roger Scott, singer and soldier Barry Sadler, who sang the Ballad of the Green Beret, and pianist John Ogden. As far as the Grammys for the actual year of 1989 went, Bonnie Raitt won Album of the Year for her comeback album, Nick of Time. Meanwhile, Bette Midler's Wind Beneath My Wings won Song and Record of the Year, and Milli Vanilli won Best New Artist. However, on October 20th, 1990, the Recording Academy, who hands out the Grammy Awards, stripped Milli Vanilli of their award when it was found out that the two people who claimed to have sung on the debut album, Fabrice Morvan and Rob Pilatus, never actually sang the songs. They are, to date, the only artists who have ever had their Grammy Award taken away from them. The award remains vacant because the Academy says it doesn't keep tabs on who placed second in the voting. For the record, the other nominees for Best New Artist that year were Neneh Cherry, the Indigo Girls, Tone Loc, and Soul II Soul. At the MTV Video Music Awards, Neil Young won Video of the Year for This Note's for You, a song about artists who started pushing corporate products like Coke and Pepsi. Less than 20 years later, that's pretty much the way the music industry works now. The show also made headlines that year for comedian Andrew Dice Clay performing not safe for work nursery rhymes during live broadcasting, which led to him getting banned from future ceremonies. At the American Music Awards, New Kids on the Block, Paula Abdul and Milli Vanilli were the big winners. No word as to whether Milli Vanilli were ever stripped of their awards on that particular ceremony. And the Billboard Music Awards that year didn't happen because they weren't started until the next year, 1990. At the Eurovision Singing Contest that was held in Switzerland that year, Riva from Croatia, then a part of Yugoslavia, won for the song Rock Me. At the Tony Awards, Jerome Robbins' Broadway won Best Musical, and Our Town won Best Revival of a Musical. The Pulitzer Prize for Music was shared between Roger Reynolds for Whispers Out of Time, Stephen Stuckey's Concerto for Orchestra, and Bright Sheng for Hewn Lacerations in Memoriam, 1966 to 1976. In the music categories for the Academy Awards, Under the Sea from The Little Mermaid won Best Original Song, and the soundtrack to The Little Mermaid won Best Original Score. The Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction ceremony took place on January 18, 1989 at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York City. At the ceremony, the Hall inducted producer Phil Spector into the non-performers category. The Ink Spots, Bessie Smith, and the Soul Stirrers were inducted into the Early Influencers category. And in the performers category, the Hall inducted Dion, the Rolling Stones, Stevie Wonder, Otis Redding, and this next group. Eddie Kendricks was born in 1939. In the late 1950s, Eddie moved to Detroit, Michigan, where he was part of a group called the Primes. The manager of the Primes would later do an all-female spin-off group called the Primettes. The world would later know that particular spin-off group as the Supremes. Once the Primes broke up, Eddie would help found the Temptations. The Temptations were formed in 1960 as a combination of two Detroit, Michigan groups, the Distance and the Primes. Over the decades, they had two different name changes, from the Elgins to the Pirates to the Temptations, finally. They also went through 25 members, at least 7 of those before what became known as the classic lineup of Eddie Kendricks, Otis Williams, David Ruffin, Paul Williams, and Melvin Franklin. It is this classic lineup that was inducted into the Hall in 1989, along with one other member who became part of their lineup in the late 1960s. The Temptations were signed to Motown Records in 1961. They went through a dry spell for the first 4 years until they got to the classic lineup in 1964. But once the song The Way You Do the Things You Do went to the top 20, things started to click for the group. They had some of the biggest hits in Motown history, including Ain't Too Proud to Beg, Just My Imagination, Get Ready, I Wish It Would Rain, and their signature song, My Girl. My Girl was written not by anyone in the Temptations, but by members of another Motown group, Smokey Robinson and the Miracles. Specifically, Smokey Robinson and Ronald White. Smokey co-wrote the song about his wife, who was Miracles member Claudette Rogers Robinson. Back in the 1960s, the major R&B record labels, Motown and Stax Records, packaged their respective groups into tours. Motown called theirs the Motown Review. One night while on tour, Smokey caught the Temptations portion of the show and was so impressed with the group that he decided to let the group record the song instead of the Miracles, who were originally supposed to record it. David Ruffin took the lead on the song. The song was released on December 21, 1964. It became not only their first #1 hit on Billboard's pop chart, but also Motown's first #1 hit on that chart. It was also the 10th biggest hit of 1965 and became their signature song. Eddie, meanwhile, did a lot of things for the group. He co-wrote a bunch of their biggest hits. He was also their wardrobe manager. He did the vocal arrangements and sang lead. Eddie was known for his high-quality falsetto vocal style at the time. In 1968, record producer Norman Whitfield started working with them, and that partnership resulted in the group helping to start the psychedelic soul movement, starting with their top 10 song Cloud 9 and continuing with Ball of Confusion. Eddie stayed with the group until 1971, when group Infighting, the way their music was straying from the ballads that the group had made their name with to a more psychedelic music direction, and also Eddie's relationship with Motown Records finally took their toll on him. David Ruffin was fired from the group in 1968 after he skipped a performance in order to watch a performance of Barbara Gale Martin, who was entertainer Dean Martin's daughter, but was also Ruffin's girlfriend at the time. That was after a time period when Ruffin got a bad case of lead singer syndrome, including an instance where he wanted the group renamed David Ruffin and the Temptations. Speaking of lead singer syndrome. Ruffin was replaced by Dennis Edwards, who helped the group do more songs with a social conscience and guide them through the 1970s. He is that extra member who ended up being inducted into the Hall of Fame. More on Kendricks and Ruffin later on. Meanwhile, the Temptations would continue on and have more hits into the 1980s, like Papa Was a Rolling Stone, Ball of Confusion, Just My Imagination, Running Away With Me, and Shaky Ground. The group also had collaborations in the 1980s with the king of punk funk himself, Mr. Rick James, on their song Standing on the Top, and on Rick's hit Super Freak, which was a huge hit the year it came out. They also had a top 10 hit when they backed up Rod Stewart on his 1991 hit, The Motown Song. Let's get back to Eddie Kendricks for a minute. Eddie Kendricks went on to have a pretty decent solo career, including having the #1 hit, Keep On Truckin'. David Ruffin, however, had some minor hits but fell out with Motown Records in 1977 after having sold really precious few of his albums, to the point where Motown didn't even release his third solo album until 2004. Kendricks, meanwhile, fell out completely with Motown in 1978 over creative and financial differences. Kendricks and Ruffin went on to perform as a duo in the early 1980s and then started working with another hot duo of the 1980s, Daryl Hall and John Oates. Both duos got together for the 1985 Hall & Oates live album, Live at the Apollo. The relationship between the two duos, however, eventually fell apart over that age-old musical demon, drugs. Specifically, David Ruffin's use of them, including his use of crack cocaine. See, Ruffin had a string of legal problems and accusations of domestic abuse. He also had a lifelong abuse of drugs, including stints in and out of rehab. Unfortunately, he never fully got rid of that demon. While visiting a crack house in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Ruffin collapsed and then died at a local hospital on June 1st, 1991 from an accidental overdose of crack cocaine. Kendricks, meanwhile, ended up dealing with lung cancer in 1991, which he blamed on his smoking for over 30 years. To think about it, how he managed to sing so well for so long while smoking is a minor miracle. Eventually, the cancer spread throughout his body, and Kendricks succumbed to cancer on October 5th, 1992. Throughout their career, the Temptations released 50 albums, including 4 live albums. Of those, the group had 7 hit the top 10. On the R&B charts, they had 23 hit the top 10, with 14 of those hitting #1. They also had 97 singles. Of those, 16 hit the top 10, with 4 of those hitting #1. On the R&B charts, 44 singles hit the top 10, with 15 of those hitting #1. The group is actually still together. They're still out there touring, although with various members now. Otis Williams is the last surviving tour member from their beginning, as Melvin Franklin passed away in 1995, Paul Williams passed away in 1973, Dennis Edwards passed away in 2018. However, they still remain one of the most important R&B vocal groups of all time. The current lineup, by the way, is Otis Williams, Ron Tyson, who joined in 1983, Terry Weeks, who joined in 1997, Tony Grant, who joined in 2021, and Jawan M. Jackson, who joined in 2022. Presented for induction by 2014 Rock and Roll Hall of Fame inductees Daryl Hall and John Oates, The Temptations, with inducted lineup members David Ruffin, Dennis Edwards, Eddie Kendricks, Melvin Franklin, Otis Williams, and Paul Williams, inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, class of 1989. Before we get to the rest of the podcast, we'd like to tell you about our other podcast, the Music History Today podcast. Every day we tell you what happened on that date in music history, along with music releases, birthdays, and passings. So, if you like this podcast and want more music history, then please search the Music History Today podcast in audio or video form on YouTube or wherever you get your podcast from. This week, we're going to look at the case for putting the Pixies into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. First, a little background. The Pixies were formed in 1986 and consisted of singer and guitarist Black Francis, guitarist Joey Santiago, drummer David Lovering, and bassist and singer Kim Deal, who, along with her twin sister Kelly Deal, would go on to form the 90s alt-rock band The Breeders, whose biggest hit was 1993's Cannonball. The Pixies themselves released 7 studio albums. Out of those, 5 of them charted in America, the highest being 2014's Indie Candy. On the UK charts, it's a completely different story. Every one of the band's albums, except for their debut album, Surfer Rosa, charted and went top 10. They also had similar charting success in New Zealand and the Netherlands. As far as their singles went, they had 6 songs hit the top 10 on the American Modern Rock chart. In the UK, they had 7 singles chart, although none of them as high as they did in America. The Pixies' biggest strength lies in their influence. If Neil Young is considered the godfather of grunge, then the Pixies are considered grunge music's biological parents. They influenced just about every major alternative group like Nirvana, The Smashing Pumpkins, Pearl Jam, Radiohead, Bush, Weezer, and way beyond. The guitar distortion, the loud blaring beginnings to the songs, then followed by the abrupt quietness before going back to rocking out, like the opening minute of, say, Nirvana's classic song Smells Like Teen Spirit, those all came from the Pixies. That was the famous loud, quiet, loud way of doing things, as they officially call it. In fact, Kurt Cobain even said that he was blatantly trying to sound like the Pixies on Teen Spirit. In fact, you would have thought that with their influence over the Seattle sound that they were actually a West Coast band. They were, in actuality, a Massachusetts band who went to my alma mater, the University of Massachusetts of Amherst. So, with a record like that, why hasn't this group gotten in? There's something I've kind of noticed about the Hall. They don't really like putting in groups who weren't hugely successful with million-selling recognizable albums and singles, but were extremely influential to groups who went on to have very successful careers with million-selling recognizable albums and singles. For instance, the Runaways were an extremely influential all-female rock band. However, a group who they directly influenced, the Go-Go's, are in, while the Runaways are still on the outside looking in. That behavior, by the way, should seriously change. The Pixies influenced an entire generation of bands, and for that, they should be inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Each week in this spot, we highlight a different musical Hall of Fame or museum, since there's a bunch more than just the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. There is, for instance, the Country Music Hall of Fame, the Blues Hall, the Grammy Museum, among many others. But this time, we're going to talk about one that isn't a hall per se. However, to me, it's probably the most important. The Library of Congress, aside from being a place in the movie All the President's Men, is the nation's library. Established in April of 1800, it has more than 38 million books, 14 million photographs, 70 million manuscripts, and 5.5 million maps. From a musical standpoint, it's important for a couple of reasons. The first is that it has over 8 million pieces of sheet music and over 3.5 million recordings. The second and most important reason is what it actually does with certain recordings. Since the passage of the National Recording Preservation Act of 2000, the library has developed a registry to preserve and protect certain pieces of music and other recordings that are considered historically relevant. That is a pretty high honor, knowing that your song or album is so important to the nation that it needs to be preserved forever. This is a pretty high-class list you're joining here, mind you. Some of these recordings are actually speeches or radio shows from yesteryear. For instance, the earliest recorded version of Abbott and Costello's Who's On First comedy sketch, also the War of the Worlds radio broadcast from Orson Welles, and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech are all in the registry, as are the first recordings on cylinders that Thomas Edison used to show off the phonograph at an exhibition. The first official class was in 2002. There were 50 recordings that were declared important that year, and all of the above-mentioned recordings were in that very first class. Joseph Sadler, a.k.a. Grandmaster Flash, was a DJ who worked the party scene back in the mid-1970s in New York City. He started working with Mean Gene Livingston, Claudio Livingston, and the Grand Wizard himself, Theodore. Flash also had 3 other friends named Keith Cowboy, Melly Mel, and Kid Creole. Then they brought in Scorpio and Raheem. By the time the group shook out, Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five, as they were finally known as, consisted of Flash, Keith Cowboy, Melly Mel, Kid Creole, Scorpio, and Raheem, which is the lineup that was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. The group came into rap when it was dominated by guys who were battle rapping and bragging, all while doing it over disco, rock, James Brown, and Parliament Funkadelic beats. The group made its name in the underground scene by playing parties, especially in Queens and Brooklyn. One Sugar Hill Records recording artist, the Sugar Hill Gang, made it big by sampling Chic's disco classic Good Times and turning it into their crossover smash hit Rapper's Delight. Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five knew that it was time to get a record deal for themselves. As luck would have it, the same record label who propelled the Sugar Hill Gang to pop chart success ended up signing Grandmaster Flash. Grandmaster Flash had their first hit with Freedom in 1980, followed by Birthday Party and the Adventures of Grandmaster Flash on the Wheels of Steel. The group is mainly known in the mainstream for 2 particular songs. Their song White Lines is about the drug trade that still gets covered to this day, most recently by Duran Duran, and also sampled by other artists like the line Something Like a Phenomenon, and also the beat for that song for LL Cool J's song Phenomenon. However, it is their classic The Message that the group is best known for. The song The Message was released as a single by Sugar Hill Records on July 1st, 1982, and was later featured on the group's debut studio album of the same name, which came out on October 3rd, 1982. The song is considered to be one of the most important and influential hip-hop songs of all time, although Flash didn't actually have a lot to do with the song, nor did he even want it released, at least according to Melody Maker magazine in 1982. The song's lyrics describe the stress of inner-city poverty. In the final verses, it is described how a child born in the ghetto without any perspective in life is lured away into crime, for which he is jailed until he commits suicide in his cell. The song was actually written by Ed Duke Booty Fletcher and Melly Mel, with the only contributing member of Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five being Melly Mel himself, who wrote the final verse. At the suggestion of Sylvia Robinson, who was the CEO and owner of Sugar Hill Records at the time, both Duke and Mel rapped on the track, with Melly Mel doing the vast majority of the rapping. Also, it should be noted that Robinson was one of the few record label heads in the world who was female in that era, and is now also a member of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame herself. At first, the group hated the song and didn't even want it released. They were afraid that no one would dance to it in the clubs because of its slow beat. Turns out, they didn't even need to worry. The song was a critical and commercial success, reaching number 62 on the Billboard Hot 100s chart. The message has also been heavily sampled, especially the lines, "Don't push me 'cause I'm close to the edge. I'm trying not to lose my head." And also, "It's like a jungle sometimes. It makes me wonder how I keep from going under." In fact, WhoSampled.com has the current sample total at 310, including Puff Daddy's song, "Can't Nobody Hold Me Down," and Ice Cube and Das EFX, "Check Yourself Before You Wreck Yourself." Samples also showed up in Tupac and Snoop Dogg's collaboration, "Two of America's Most Wanted," with the line, "I keep my hand on my gun 'cause it got me on the run." In fact, Snoop has had the message sampled on at least 3 tracks that he either rapped or collabed on. Genesis used it to help shape their song Mama, and it was in the video game Grand Theft Auto Vice City. It even got sampled lyrically in the Broadway smash musical Hamilton. As far as Grandmaster Flash and the Furious 5 went after their landmark album and song, they actually broke up over royalty disputes in 1984, but then got back together in 1987 before finally breaking up permanently in 1990 after Keith Cowboy's death in 1989. If you're lucky, though, you can still check out Grandmaster Flash spinning vinyl at your local club. In fact, he showed up on an Instagram live stream, which also got put to YouTube, for DJ Jazzy Jeff's little YouTube channel. You should check that out. It's a classic. The Message is considered to this day to be one of the most important and influential hip-hop songs of all time. It was one of the songs that took hip-hop away from being a bunch of party anthems and diss tracks and took it into current topics and social commentary, along with Grandmaster Flash's song White Lines. Its lyrics are honest, brutal, in your face, and sugarcoat absolutely nothing. Even in this era of cancel culture at its height, so far no one at least has tried to bury the song because there are a couple of homophobic slurs in there, especially in the last verse once the protagonist ends up in jail. Regardless, The Message helped to legitimize hip-hop as a serious art form and pave the way for future socially conscious hip-hop artists like Public Enemy, Rage Against the Machine, and KRS-One and Boogie Down Productions. The song's lyrics are still relevant today, and they continue to resonate with people everywhere, regardless of race or social status. Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five's 1982 hip-hop classic, The Message. Inducted into the Library of Congress National Recording Registry in Washington, D.C., class of 2002. And that is it for this episode of the Music Halls of Fame podcast. For more podcast episodes, which drop every Thursday in audio and video form, then please like, subscribe, and click the notification bell on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio Podcasts, CastBox, Google Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts from.